Okay, thank you, Gemma. So I'm going to talk about local government and the nations. Is it really a devolution revolution? Before doing that, let's take a look at the cuts to the local government spending in England announced yesterday. Well, as Gemma said, the Chancellor announced a cut in the local government department expenditure limit of 56% by 2019-20. But, as this pie chart shows, the grants that local authorities get only make up a small proportion of their overall spending. They get money from the retained business rates they keep, and they get a large chunk from council tax. And these other areas are going to go up over the next few years, not least because they now have more freedom to put up council tax. And that means the Treasury estimates that council spending power will be reduced by about 7% in real terms on average over the next 4 years. But this could vary substantially across different councils in England. Now, to see this, let's look at what happened under the last Parliament. So, between 2009-10 and 2015-16, councils' spending power, on average, was reduced by 25%. But that varied substantially across different kinds of councils. On the left-hand side, you've got councils that were very reliant on grant in the first place, and the cuts in grants, therefore, had a much bigger impact on them. So they saw falls in their spending power of 40% on average. Whereas on the right, you've got those councils not very dependent on grant, so therefore cuts didn't impact on their spending power so much, so seeing falls of 15% on average. Those that are more dependent tend to be the kind of poorer authorities, more urban ones. Those that are less dependent tend to be more leafier, kind of shire and more affluent areas. So a differential impact of the cuts across the country. Now, looking ahead to 2019-20, what happens will depend on how the cuts to grants are allocated across different kinds of authorities. Now, if the government continued to give equal percentage cuts to grants to all authorities, as they have been over the last few years, well, that would continue to hit grant-dependent authorities harder. As we just saw, that's the areas that have seen the biggest cuts already. So you could be seeing some areas seeing cuts up to 50% compared to 2020. On the other hand, he could rejig the formula so that it delivers a different pattern of overall spending cuts. So, for instance, to aim for equal cuts in spending power across councils. That would be close to the approach used in Wales so far, for instance. And we'll find out more in December's local government financial settlement. The spending review document does suggest that cuts formula will change. So some of us at least will await with bated breath on that. Now, in recent years, councils have needed a referendum to approve increases in their council tax by more than 2% a year. Yesterday, the Chancellor announced that they'll be able to increase council tax by 2% more each year without a local referendum if that extra is spent on adult social care. So presumably, they'll require a referendum only if they increase their council tax by more than 4% a year. Now, if they used this additional 2% each year, after 4 years, that would raise £1.7 billion if used in full. Now, this 4 times 2% increases in council tax, this £1.7 billion is equivalent to 11% of what is spent on adult social care in England in 2015-16. So if they use this, they could increase spending on this by 11% compared to now. But this varies substantially across England, depending on how much council tax authorities raise and how much they spend on adult social care. As we see in this graph, we see big variations in the proportion they could increase their social care spending by, from as little as 4% in Wandsworth, where anyone living in Nappy Valley will know council tax is very low, to as high as up to 17-18% in Rutland. Now, these are outliers, but there is quite a diversity across authorities. Those authorities that tend to get relatively less from this increases compared to their social spending include many urban areas that have relatively high spending, relatively low council tax. those that can raise more towards the funding of their social care include those in leafier areas that tend to have higher council tax revenues and tend to have lower needs for social care spending. So a couple of examples on the screen there. Now, this begs the question of how the government will know if local authorities are spending this extra money on social care. How do you measure whether they are doing this? Well, there are several options of how you could assess this. One could be to say, well, let's see if the cash terms increase in the social care budget is equal to how much they're raising from these additional council tax. But what if they wanted to cut social care spending in the absence of this policy, given the real pressures in the budget? As well as spending the extra council tax, they'd also have to shift money from other budgets to pay for social care, which could be challenging for them to do. So what if you instead said that you'll estimate what council would have spent on social care without this policy? The government could go and say to councils, what would you have spent if you didn't have this extra 2%? Well, in that case, it's very difficult to verify and ensure this is generally new money. The councils have an incentive to exaggerate how much they would have cut social care spending in the absence of this policy. So really tricky to see how they can actually calculate this in practice. Let's move on to changes in the local government funding system, some broader changes. At the moment, the Business Rates Retention Scheme means that individual councils keep up to 50% of the business rates growth in the area that results from new developments, from refurbishments. Now, this business rates so they keep the new things from growth. They don't keep all the business rates raised in the area. Business rates from existing premises are redistributed across councils from those that have high business rates to those that have low business rates to stop there being big winners and losers from the system. And there are also some levies and safety nets in there that if over time the new growth means that some authorities do very well and some do very badly, there are levies and safety nets to stop that divergence becoming too big. The Chancellor confirmed yesterday that individual councils going forwards by 2020 will keep 100% of the business rates growth in the area as a result of new developments. Now, again, this is not 100% of all the business rates raised in the area. Again, they'll continue to have this redistribution of the existing stock of business rates between rich and poor authorities to stop there being overnight winners and overnight losers. But over time, the additional growth, the 100% of additional growth, can add up and can lead to big differences in funding over time for different kinds of authorities. So the winning councils will be those that see growth in their business rates that's large in cash terms relative to their budget. Now, a given percentage growth translates into more cash if you start with a higher level of business rates. So if you're someone like Westminster, where masses of business rates are raised, it's relatively easier for you to win from this system than if you're somewhere like Waltham Forest or Wolverhampton, which start off with relatively low amounts of business rates. So this could lead to divergence across different parts of the country based on where they start from. So the government is going to consult on capping this funding divergence, if it needs to, and if it decides it does, how to do it. Now, when business rates are fully devolved, the grants that councils currently get will be abolished. But the extra business rates that councils will then get to keep in aggregate will be more than the grants that are being abolished. So the Chancellor said that councils will have to take on new responsibilities to use this extra money. Again, the details are going to be consulted on. There were a few examples listed in the statement: housing benefit admin costs for pensioners, maybe public health services that they currently provide but have a separate grant to fund. We'd expect some bigger things to go over because these won't make up enough money, so you might expect some bigger things. Police, maybe, or areas of healthcare, or other things. Details will be consulted on in the new year. An important question is that if councils are getting all their money from council tax and business rates, there's no grants anymore, will the revenues they get from this keep pace with the demands on their services? The ones they already have, like social care, and the ones they're going to have devolved to them. If not, Will they need to find new sources of revenue to pay for these? Or will grants need to be reintroduced at some point in the future to pay for rising demands for some of these services if their council tax and business rates don't keep up? Now, this has been part of a big shift in funding of local government from the central government down to the local funding of councils. Back in 2009-10, councils got about 60% of their budget from grants, the rest from council tax. Cuts in grants and the part localisation of business rates has changed that already. But if full business rates retention is introduced in 2019, we'll move to a system where grants are got rid of, and it's all based on council tax and business rates. And that really will be a revolutionary change. It will be kind of reversing the direction of travel from the previous kind of 30 years, and it'll mean local authorities will have more incentives to grow their revenues and more accountability, but it'll also mean more risk and more potential for divergence. So it really is a big change. What isn't such a big change are the new powers that the Chancellor trumpeted again in his talk yesterday. He said that local authorities will gain the power to cut headline business rates. Well, they can already use the power over local reliefs to the same effect. Well, perhaps the more explicit labelling of this as a rate cut as opposed to relief might encourage more use, but it's not really a huge new power, and these are powers that haven't been used in the past. He also said there'll be an ability to levy a 2p supplement to fund infrastructure if you have elected mayor and the agreement of business members of your local enterprise partnership. Councils already have similar powers for such supplements, and the new powers are less constrained in some ways than the current ones, but more constrained in others. So these reforms don't look quite so revolutionary in terms of the new powers for councils. But there have been big changes for the devolved governments. The Chancellor confirmed that Northern Ireland will get control of corporation tax in April 2018. Their intention is to have a 12.5% to match that in the Republic. There will be the tricky issue of agreeing what's called the fiscal framework to go alongside this. Things like how do you just a block grant? What borrowing powers does Northern Ireland have? There have been some very tricky negotiations with Scotland on that over the last few months. Expect these to be just as tricky because corporation tax has some difficult issues involved. Northern Ireland expects this to cost around £240 million a year to do this cut, but of course the hope is that with a lower tax rate they'll attract more business and it'll start to pay for itself over time and improve the economy. He also announced that there'd be no need for a referendum for devolve income tax to Wales. If that took place, that would devolve £2.5 billion of revenues to Wales, so you need to make an equivalent adjustment to the block grant. And he also announced a new funding floor for Wales, which would mean that spending in Wales couldn't fall below 115% of the comparable spending in England. And that's to account for the higher needs in Wales. Wales has argued that it hasn't been getting enough money at the moment, and it needs a funding floor to prevent it losing out in future. Interesting thing is, this funding floor has been set at a level that it doesn't bind in the current spending review period. It's a floor that would have been met anyway. We'll see what happens in the next spending review period when the floor will be reset. And finally, a flaw in the Barnett formula has been fixed. Previously, the Barnett formula has treated spending in England funded by business rates in a flawed way. And because of this, Scotland, in the last Parliament, avoided about £600 million of cuts that England and Wales bore, and Northern Ireland had avoided £200 million of cuts. So fixing this going forwards, well, it doesn't undo these earlier gains that Scotland and Northern Ireland had from the floor being there in the first place, but it does stop them growing further in the years ahead. And as Paul said, this is a flaw that a certain IFS researcher pointed out last year to the Treasury. And, you know, I do think it's a good idea that it's been fixed. You know, clearly it's good to have a formula that works in the way you intend it to, rather than having a flaw in there. So to summarise, how cuts to council spending in England vary across the country will depend on how the formula used to calculate the grant cuts is set in the settlement next month. The full retention of business rates is the culmination of a big shift from central to local funding in recent years, and taken together, this is genuinely revolutionary. But there will be winners and losers. There will be risks as well as incentives. The new power severity rates, on the other hand, are not so revolutionary as they seem. There's devolution of corporation tax to Northern Ireland and income tax to Wales, and this is part of big changes to devolved government finance, especially in Scotland. We wait to see what agreement will be reached with Scotland on the new fiscal framework. And the Barnett formula will stay in place, but at least one flaw has been fixed.